Genocide, Exploring Complicity in Digital Spaces. My name is Nada Awad. I am the Human Rights Council Advocacy Coordinator, and I will moderate this event. October will mark 1 year since Israel's war on Gaza and 1 year of failure of states to meet their obligations under international law to put an end to the genocide against the Palestinian people. According to the ICJ advisory opinion from July 2024, Israel's legislation and measures constitute a breach of Article 3 of CERD pertaining to racial segregation and apartheid. While the ICJ issued provisional measures and an advisory opinion stressing the legal consequences for third states and the United Nations, experts continue to raise alarm at states' unwillingness to put an end to Israel's impunity. Special procedures continue to deplore that they have raised the alarm at the risk of genocide for a month, reminding all governments they have a duty to prevent genocide, and stressing that not only is Israel killing and causing irreparable harm against Palestinian civilians with its indiscriminate bombardments, it is also knowingly and intentionally imposing a high rate of disease, prolonged malnutrition, dehydration, starvation, by destroying civilian infrastructure. The UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of the human rights in the occupied Palestinian territory, in her March report to this Council, entitled Anatomy of a Genocide, concluded, I quote, there are reasonable grounds to believe that Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. States that continue to provide military, economic, and political support to Israel, while suppressing fundamental freedoms such as expression and assembly, which we will talk about today, as well as attacking independent courts and experts, and defunding humanitarian aid, are complicit in the commission of crimes. As Hamle will discuss in this event, tech companies are complicit in misinformation campaigns, leading to the defunding of civil society organizations and UNRWA by Western states. This is a strategy implemented by Israel and discursively imposed by some states to silence the work of human rights defenders and ensure the demise of the Palestinian refugee issue through the defunding of UNRWA, and with it, the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. Our organizations continue to be alarmed at the international community's double standards and failure to uphold international law, and the numerous UN resolutions, urgent calls, and recommendations by UN special procedures, treaty bodies, and accountability mechanisms. This also includes communications to tech companies, including Google, Meta, X, and Telegram, on increased criminalization, surveillance, harassment, and attacks against individuals who are peacefully expressing dissent or advocating for Palestinian rights on social media. Civil society and international experts have raised grave concern at the attacks on fundamental freedoms when advocating for the rights of Palestinians by Western states, online and offline. The attacks on freedom of expression, assembly, and association being monitored since October 2023 are by no means a new trend. However, there has been a notable escalation in the intensity of these attacks, as well as the political and legal measures put forward to curtail fundamental freedoms in relation to Palestine. Western governments, who regularly call for protection of human rights and civic space, are emboldening Israel's indiscriminate attacks by cracking down on free expression and peaceful assembly, online and offline. Authorities have resorted to banning the holding of demonstrations, cracked down on demonstrators, arrested protesters. Individuals have been fired from their jobs for voicing opinions on social media. People have also faced hate speech, censorship, and self-censorship, fearing reprisals, including discrimination and criminalization for voicing their opinions online and offline. Special procedures have concluded that the undue restrictions imposed by states, especially Western states, on peaceful protests and civil society working to protect human rights and humanitarian law in the context of the Gaza war are contrary to states' obligations under international law to prevent atrocity crimes such as genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and apartheid. Special procedures have also addressed how risks of potential anti-Semitism have also been used as a justification by some states to ban and criminalize peaceful assemblies and expression in support of Palestinian rights. Civil society have for years decried and deplored the misuse by Israel and Western states of this argument to suppress Palestinian rights advocacy through the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. The Arab Center, Washington, D.C. stressed, for example, I quote, that conflation between anti-Semitism and legitimate criticism of Israeli crimes against Palestinians, heightened by the adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA definition of anti-Semitism by many states and organizations, leads to the silencing of Palestinian voices. This normalization of anti-Palestinian racism has reflected on social media and their content moderation norms, as we will see with Hamle, and led to an alarming proliferation of this dangerous rhetoric. I will now turn to Jalal. Jalal Abukhater is the Advocacy Manager at Hamle, the Arab Center for the Advancement of Social Media. Jalal will present Hamle's report, which highlights the extensive use of technology in committing and exacerbating human rights violations. Jalal, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, dear Nada. My name is Jalal Abukhater, Advocacy Manager at Hamle, the Arab Center for the Advancement of Social Media. Hamle is an organization, a civil society organization dedicated to the protection of digital rights of Palestinians, of course, and in the context of that we're speaking of today, we have been observing how over the past year, the digital rights of Palestinians are as intertwined with every single human right that's been violated during the context of the ongoing war on Gaza. We have to, of course, first acknowledge that the humanitarian suffering, the amount of suffering is ongoing. We still demand, first and foremost, an end to the violence, an immediate ceasefire, immediately for us to be able to discuss what comes next. For the time being, we have recently released a report. We'll share some copies at the table that you can grab any copy at the end. Palestinian Digital Rights, Genocide, and Big Tech Accountability. This report basically summarizes a lot of our observations over the past year when it comes to digital rights of the Palestinians, how they've been violated, and also the context of big tech corporations and how they've played a role in violating people's rights and also exacerbating international crimes, violations against Palestinians by perhaps, I will mention more in a bit. The findings of this report are crucial, are important. We are looking at a new frontier, how new technologies are being used in the war on Gaza, how artificial intelligence plays a role, how companies like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, and others are complicit in ongoing rights violations amidst the genocidal war on Gaza. We focus a lot on this in the report and invite you all to read it, of course, but I'll present a brief on what's mainly on this report. Basically, the report addresses three main areas. We look at how online platforms, social media platforms like, for example, Meta's Instagram and Facebook, Google's YouTube, Twitter, formerly Twitter, X, and Telegram, TikTok, and other platforms have played a role in rights violations against Palestinians. We look at how Meta's platforms, for example, have been prominent in suppressing people's right to free expression, denying access to information, denying the right to political assembly. Meta platforms, particularly Facebook and Instagram, have been prominent in this regard, as our center has manually documented over 5,000 cases since October of digital rights violations that relate to the right to free expression. People's accounts have been blocked, journalists have been unable to report, people have not been able to access information in Gaza due to the complicit role of those online platforms. As I mentioned, most of the cases of censorship and rights violations when it comes to free expression have been occurring on Meta's platforms. However, we also look at online platforms when it comes to the spread of inflammatory content, hate speech, incitement to genocide, etc. We look at, for example, the platform X, Twitter formerly. We see that there are over between October and December of last year, we documented over 3 million instances of inflammatory content targeting Palestinians in the Hebrew language, mainly on Twitter. We also address how Meta platforms have not been investing enough to prevent incitement to genocide against Palestinians in the Hebrew language by not investing in classifiers for the hostile language in Hebrew. Of course, when we talk about incitement to genocide taking place on online platforms, we are talking about rhetoric that contributes heavily and significantly to the ongoing violence that Palestinians face on the ground. Before the war in Gaza began, we were reporting how rhetoric inciting against Palestinians had been leading directly to attacks in the West Bank, on villages of the West Bank, where settlers were organizing on online platforms to attack villages such as Hawara in the West Bank. However, in the context of this war, we have seen an unprecedented amount of hate speech and incitement to genocide taking place, often without platforms addressing those issues, of course, in violation of the platform's obligations under international legal frameworks, which I will mention later. Of course, there's also another aspect of inflammatory content and harmful content. Those are problematic advertising material. We've seen how on Meta's platform, Facebook, there's been advertising that calls for violence against Palestinians, which has been approved by the company, or advertising that calls for Palestinians in the West Bank to leave to Jordan, of course, contributing to the forced expulsion of Palestinians. That kind of advertising that occurred on Meta is also found on YouTube, for example, where the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs invested heavily in the early days after October 7 to disseminate material that is often inflammatory, inaccurate, and contributed to justifying the ongoing violence against Palestinians. In 2 weeks only after October 7, Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs spent over $7 million US dollars in advertising material, which was targeting heavily people in Europe, in the US, in the UK, with content that justifies Israeli military action against people in Gaza. YouTube has a responsibility to adhere to human rights standards, and many of those advertising material were removed. However, we call on the company to have more robust mechanisms in place beforehand. We also saw how Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and often other ministries, such as the Ministry of Diaspora, been involved in campaigns such as sponsoring disinformation against UNRWA, UN refugee agency in Gaza, during a time when UN experts were calling for a relief of what they call famine across the entire Gaza Strip, when there was weaponized starvation on Gaza. UNRWA was the only responsible agency distributing essentially humanitarian aid to people in Gaza. And during that time, some platforms such as Google were providing ad space for Israeli ministry and other organizations based in Tel Aviv to promote advertising material that would discredit UNRWA using often disinformation. We also call on those companies to be more robust in the mechanisms of respecting people's human rights when it comes to disseminating disinformation on online platforms. Online platforms have a major role to play, but that's just one aspect of what we will cover in our talk. We also look at how new technologies have been introduced in the war on Gaza. We see artificial intelligence, data, and cloud services by major companies, and how the killing has been automated in Gaza. The report looks at how surveillance and data collection have increased at an unprecedented level, whereas the Israeli military has actually utilized the services of major companies such as Google and Amazon through Project Nimbus, through a contract worth over 1.2 billion US dollars. Also, the company Microsoft is involved in this regard, in providing cloud services to the IDF at a time when it would facilitate the Israeli military's data processing of surveillance data, such as sound bites, video, biometric data, everything they collect on Palestinians through different mechanisms of total surveillance, utilizing artificial intelligence tools, whereas those would be used in targeting people on the ground. Often we associate the high number of civilian casualties that were reported in the first few months of the war on Gaza. The high number of civilian casualties is attributed to several artificial intelligence programs. Some of them are called Lavender, Where's Daddy, the gospel, systems which have been employed and used using various amount of data to automatically pick out targets and automatically point to this house or this individual, tracking their movement, of course. For example, the gospel would assign that this building is to be targeted. Human intervention is minimal, less than 5% human intervention. The rest is a machine that decides which target to bomb. Lavender would target individuals and create hundreds of targets per day. Even by the admission of Israeli military, Israeli intelligence officials, the programs have contributed heavily to the large amount of targets that were created, something that even those intelligence officers were not able to create on their own. They would be able to create like 100 targets per month, for example, in Gaza. But those programs were coming up with hundreds of targets per day at a unprecedented rate that contributes to the huge toll of civilian casualties in Gaza. We understand that those artificial intelligence programs could not have been utilized as effectively if it wasn't for the role of companies like Google and Amazon providing their cloud services to the IDF at a time when the IDF themselves had said, we are not capable of processing this large amount of data through our own systems, and we had to utilize public systems such as those provided by major companies. It's very important that those companies are to be held accountable for this role in contributing to rights violations in Gaza. We also look at how how killing has been automated in Gaza. We look at how drones, quadcopter drones, for the first time in many cases, unprecedented seen on the front lines of war. Quadcopter drones would be able to track, identify, and follow targets. 95% of the effort to target and kill an individual in Gaza would be done in an autonomous basis, and sometimes it would require like a click of a button by an individual, a human individual, to say execute or kill this target. However, when the role of the human individual when it comes to lethal actions such as a quadcopter drone tracking and killing a person is so minimal, it shows that there is huge disregard to an assessment that would justify or would even allow for such killing to occur. The killing is being done mainly by the decision and by the suggestion of machines. And that's what we're seeing in Gaza, and we talk about in this report extensively. There are, of course, many ethical and legal issues concerned with this. There are obligations of the companies that are not being respected and are being violated. This is also very important for us to discuss. The new frontiers of war, what happens in Palestine today could find itself occurring elsewhere in different wars, and the tools that Israel is innovating and using today could be found in the hands of various regimes elsewhere around the world. So whatever happens here, it's like a laboratory. Israel promotes those weapons as battle-tested against the Palestinians and then sold in international markets to other countries to violate more people's rights. Major ethical concerns and legal concerns right here. However, we also address in the report the other issue of how communication blackouts have been weaponized as part of the digital warfare against Palestinians. Telecommunications blackouts have been used as a weapon of war. Major issue, of course, in how Israel has deliberately cut off Gaza from communication services, both by deliberately cutting off fiber optic lines, by destroying infrastructure, destroying towers. Within the first few days, internet connectivity in Gaza went down to 20%, and we encountered many total communication blackouts which were occurring deliberately. Of course, when we follow up on those issues, we discuss, we find out that sometimes it's just a manual button that Israel will press and cut off all fiber optics in Gaza, disabling people's access to emergency services, disabling people's access to those outside of the strip. If anyone doesn't have a satellite phone, satellite phones could be available with some press journalists, for example, but they're lacking in Gaza. So it would mean a total blackout on communication, causing a huge humanitarian impact on people on the ground. They prevent journalists, aid workers, human rights organizations from documenting war crimes and delivering the message. And of course, reporting back to the world on what's happening inside Gaza. We all understand that foreign journalists have not been allowed into Gaza to observe the ongoing war crimes that have been taking place. And the only way that we are able to look into Gaza and see what's happening is through the lens of people inside the Strip who have been able to report through social media, send out information through different means, sharing videos. Basically, journalists in Gaza have been telling the world on what's happening, while Israel has prevented any foreign press access into Gaza for foreign press to document with their own eyes what is ongoing on the ground. Of course, there's a international humanitarian law violation by denying people's access to the internet in this way. International IHL basically guarantees access to information even during such war. There are broader implications to all of this, of course. The internet communication blackouts. The report presents a few recommendations. Of course, first and foremost is it calling for an immediate ceasefire. The most urgent recommendation actually is for an end to the war in Gaza, because without the peace, basically, there wouldn't be any progress on digital rights or human rights protection, and we cannot achieve anything without immediate ceasefire in Gaza. We also talk about big tech companies and how they must be held accountable. There are responsibilities. Companies like Meta, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and others must be held accountable for any seeming complicity in facilitating war crimes and crimes against humanity. Those companies must adopt human rights-centered approach in their operations. They must ensure that they are not complicit in violating people's rights. They must conduct independent human rights assessments constantly to ensure that they are not disseminating problematic advertising, disinformation. They're not violating people's rights at a large scale. They're not disseminating harmful content that contributes to the violence on the ground in Gaza. All of this, of course, should be public and should be transparent, those assessments on impact, human rights impact. Of course, those companies, as we all know, have an obligation to adhere to international law. They must align their practices with international human rights law, including the ICCPR and the ICESCR. In conclusion, without accountability for both states and private tech actors, digital rights violations and complicity in war crimes will continue. Accountability is what we ask for today. It's a responsibility of everyone in this room, of course, including international community, tech platforms, civil society, to push for stronger legal frameworks and mechanisms to ensure that human rights and digital rights are protected, to ensure regulation of those new technologies in time of war, and ensure that people's human rights and digital rights are safeguarded at all times. I thank you very much. We now go for a quick, sorry, I'll leave it to you, Nada. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Hamle for documenting the extensive use of technology in committing and exacerbating human rights violations, both by the Israeli government, which has utilized, as you have said, artificial intelligence to target Palestinians, and by tech companies, which have played a significant role in facilitating censorship, withholding information, and indirectly contributing to the efforts of the Israeli government in the context of the ongoing genocide in Gaza. We will now turn to a video statement by Fernanda Hopenhaym. She is the chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights.
Cabrera, and I'm currently the chair of the UN Working Group. Good afternoon. I'm Fernanda Hopenhaym Cabrera, and I'm currently the chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to join you live, so I thank the organizers for the opportunity to share this message through a video recording. Since October 2023, the special procedures have been monitoring the situation in Gaza. We have condemned the October 7th attacks on Israeli civilians and have issued several communications and press releases regarding the violations of the human rights of the Palestinian people and the high risks they are continually facing under the attacks by Israel in Gaza. Specifically, the working group has addressed, obviously, the role of companies. As some of you may know, the working group, together with other mandates from special procedures, has issued two key communications in recent months. One on the arms trade to Israel, directing letters to arms manufacturers, as well as to their investors and their home states, highlighting the risks of potentially contributing to genocide through their business, and another one to tech companies and their home states regarding the use of online platforms in the face of the war in Gaza. On this second case, the working group highlighted the information received concerning a number of alleged human rights violations in Israel on the occupied Palestinian territories since October 7th, 2023, including increased criminalization, surveillance, harassment, and attacks against individuals who are peacefully expressing dissent or advocating for Palestinian rights on social media. We have observed the proliferation of hate speech, incitement to violence, disinformation and bias, and systematic censorship of Palestinian and pro-Palestinian human rights voices and content related to Palestine on social media platforms, including Meta, X, Google, and Telegram. You can access all those letters that we issued, as well as the responses we have received, including from Meta and Google, on the working group website in the section about communications. These two cases are just an example of how companies can contribute or be directly linked to human rights abuses. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, adopted by the Human Rights Council of the United Nations in 2011, highlight the responsibility companies have to respect human rights and to implement human rights due diligence processes to prevent and address harm, and include a particular emphasis on businesses operating in conflict-affected areas. Additionally, the working group has developed a body of work around this particular issue, stating that businesses operating in high-risk environments, which includes, of course, conflict-affected areas, must conduct enhanced human rights due diligence. This means that they should pay a much closer attention to the potential consequences of its operations and their value chain when conducting businesses in those areas, and deploy appropriate reinforced measures to identify, prevent, and address human rights adverse impacts. Moreover, the UNGPs, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, cover all internationally recognized human rights, which means that businesses must undertake prevention measures in a broad range of activities, and not only those that may seem to be directly linked to the armed conflict itself. That is why not only arms manufacturers have a direct responsibility, but also other companies from other sectors conducting businesses in or connected to those areas. At the same time, international humanitarian law not only binds states, organized armed groups and soldiers, of course, but it also binds the personnel of private businesses in certain circumstances, as it is binding to anyone whose activities are closely linked to an armed conflict. Determining which business activities are closely linked to an armed conflict is complex, as companies carry out a broad range of activities that could be perceived as linked to or connected to an armed conflict. As said before, some businesses may provide direct support, for example, military support, logistical support to the conflict, while other businesses may be considered as linked to the armed conflict, even if they did not actually intend to support the conflict or a specific party to the conflict. Given the difficulty to determine which businesses are or not closely linked to an armed conflict, the working group always recommends that all businesses conduct enhanced human rights due diligence when operating in those areas and remain alert to revisit those processes and the measures that they put in place as a result of those processes as the conflict evolves and unfolds, of course. From the perspective of international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international standards such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which of course are based on international human rights law, businesses have a responsibility to respect human rights in all circumstances, including during conflict. This is why it is essential for businesses to conduct their operations under the highest standards and engage with civil society and right holders to have a full understanding of the potential or actual impacts of their activities in conflict-affected areas. The working group and other special procedures will continue to highlight this responsibility and contribute to push for corporate accountability in the war on Gaza and in all other conflicts that are active at this moment. Thank you very much, and I wish you have a very fruitful conversation.
Thank you to Fernanda, from the chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, for her video statement, where she focused on the duties of businesses, particularly in the context of the war on Gaza. I will now turn to Marwa Fatafta, who is joining us online. She is the MENA Policy Manager at Access Now. She leads the work of the Organization on Digital Rights in the Middle East and North Africa. Marwa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nada, and thanks to Hamle and ICHR for organizing this very important and timely event. As Nada said, I work at Access Now. We are a global digital rights organization. Our mission is to defend and extend the rights of people and communities at risk, and the situation in Gaza, as Jalal already highlighted, is one of those situations where we've been monitoring and documenting very closely the reverberations of the war online and the harms it presents to people at risk in Gaza, in the West Bank, and beyond. And since Jalal had already delved into the issue of social media platforms, whether it be the crackdown or the censorship of Palestinian and pro-Palestinian voices, as well as the negligence to remove in a timely manner illegal and harmful content, including incitement to genocide, inflammatory content, hate speech, state-sponsored and non-state-sponsored disinformation. I will focus on another big issue that we have seen in Gaza and that shocked many, to be quite honest, and that is the use of AI in warfare and potentially the complicity of tech companies in international crimes perpetrated by the Israeli authorities in Gaza through the use of the services provided by these companies. I'm sure many of you in the room have heard of the AI systems that the Israeli army deployed in Gaza in the beginning of the war. Those systems have not necessarily been deployed for the first time, but given the scale and the intensity of the war in Gaza, they've drawn much attention. So, for example, systems like the Gospel, which the Israeli army uses to automatically generate targets of infrastructure to be bombed, or Lavender, which generates targets related to individuals that need to be bombed, in addition to using AI capabilities for facial recognition and the biometric identification of Palestinians, which Israel used or has been using in the West Bank, but now with the ground invasion has managed to also roll out and deploy in the Gaza Strip, to using AI technologies in order to calculate collateral damage among other services such as live tracking targets and overall surveillance. After those revelations were made in the press, we've reached out to one particular company, and that is Google, given its provision of AI services and cloud computing capabilities to the Israeli authorities through Project Nimbus together with Amazon Web Services, and that is a $1.2 billion contract. There is very little known about what type of services or that will be or has been provided to the Israeli authorities. But what we know is that the project itself aims at providing the Israeli government with cloud computing services, including artificial intelligence and machine learning. Now, from the Israeli Ministry of Finance that was responsible for the bid, we know that the project is intended to provide the government, including the defense establishment, such as the Ministry of Defense, the IDF, with an all-encompassing cloud solution. Now, whereas Google has repeatedly claimed that its contract with the Israeli government is not directed at highly sensitive, classified, or military workloads relevant to weapons or intelligence services, there's a number of already publicly available information that raises questions around that statement. For example, The Intercept media outlet published a trove of training data, documents, and videos obtained by them through a publicly accessible educational portal intended for Nimbus users in Israel, where Google is providing the Israeli government with full suite of machine learning and AI tools available on the Google Cloud platform. And whereas they do not provide any specifics as how these services will be used, but the documents indicate that the cloud gives Israel, for example, capabilities related to facial detection, automated image categorization, object tracking, sentiment analysis, including assessment of emotional content of pictures, speech, and writing. And those Nimbus training materials also reference agency-specific trainings available to government personnel in Israel through this online learning service, citing the Ministry of Defense as an example. There was also another extremely disturbing document which may put Google at risk of being complicit in facilitating or abetting international crimes, including violations of international law, where, according to the bid of Project Nimbus, there is a list of Israeli companies and government offices that should use the services provided by Amazon Web Services and Google, shall they need cloud computing services. And those include, for example, state-owned weapons manufacturers such as Israeli Aerospace Industries and Rafael Advanced Defense Systems. Those are two companies that have been well documented for violating or contributing or providing technologies and weaponry to the Israeli government and have been used heavily to bomb civilians in Gaza since 2008. And there are also other examples of conflicts around the world where these companies have been complicit, but I will not delve into that for today's discussion. But important to note that other potential cloud customers of Google is also the settlement division of the World Zionist Organization, which is a non-governmental agency that is entrusted by the Israeli government to establish and develop Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And of course, there is now very clear consensus on the illegality of Israeli settlements under international law, emphasized by the ICJ's most recent advisory opinion on the illegality of Israeli occupation, and followed by the subsequent UNGA resolution calling on states to not recognize Israel's illegal occupation in the occupied Palestinian territories and not to provide any aid or assistance that helps maintain this illegal occupation, including building and maintaining of settlements. Now, amidst the war, there were also media reports that actually in March 2024, Google had actually deepened its business relationships with the Israeli government and signed a new contract which allowed the Israeli Ministry of Defense to have access to Google automation technologies. And another recent investigation by the 972 magazine also found, indeed, that the Israeli army has used AI capabilities from Google, as well as Amazon Web Services and Microsoft in order to process the large troves of data collected on Palestinians or of Palestinians through mass surveillance during the war. And finally, I'd also mention here that, while Google insists that according to its self-proclaimed AI principles that it publishes on its website, that it will not design or deploy any AI applications as weapons or weapon systems or for mass surveillance. There was another investigation by the New York Times which revealed the use of facial recognition technologies in Gaza, as I mentioned, and where the Israeli army intelligence officers use Google Photos in order to identify Palestinians. By uploading pictures of Palestinians to a database, Israeli officials can use these systems to identify individuals. And we all know that there is now tens of thousands of Palestinians who have been identified and abducted and detained under extremely inhumane conditions and subject to torture, rape, and ill treatment. Now, despite all of that information, and despite protests also from its own tech workers, and requests from civil society for transparency and accountability with regards to what services exactly is Google providing to the Israeli government, and have they conducted any heightened human rights due diligence to ensure that those services are not being used for military ends or to commit international crimes, especially in light of the ICJ decision on the imminent and plausible risk of genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. Unfortunately, I mean, we sent the letter in May, but unfortunately, we have not received any response. And to date, none of the companies, tech companies that Jalal spoke of, including, for instance, Meta, X, Google, Amazon Web Services, or Microsoft, have done any heightened human rights due diligence to identify, mitigate, and remedy human rights risks associated with the services and the actions and the policies they provide in the context of Palestine. And also, there has been no meaningful engagement with civil society, let alone rights holders in this case. I think there, with the exception of one company, civil society, where, you know, it is difficult for companies to access directly rights holders. They can, of course, engage with civil society and human rights experts on behalf of these communities. But to date, and I think Jalal can concur, that we have not been contacted nor have been engaged by these companies with regards to the human rights due diligence exercise. And now, you know, we've heard from the chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights on the UN Guiding Principles. And again, I want to iterate that companies do have a responsibility here to respect human rights, and that responsibility becomes even heightened in situations of armed conflict where businesses face greater risk of being directly linked or complicit in international crimes and gross human rights abuses perpetrated by other parties, even when they don't intend to support such actions or crimes. And we've discussed the human rights due diligence aspect, but there's also two other important aspects related to business conduct according to the UN Guiding Principles that we see absolutely lacking. One that is, you know, companies should show their commitment to respecting human rights through policy commitment and embedding, developing, and articulating human rights policies commitments through their entire supply chain and the entire company services, and also remediate, which we often forget in the context of armed conflict or crises that we see in Gaza. So even the basic minimum of conducting human rights due diligence, let alone remediating, has been completely absent in the situation of the war in Gaza. And therefore, I think even though there has been by now, starting from the ICJ ruling on the plausibility of the risk of genocide, all the way to the UN Human Rights Council resolution in March this year, which made it very clear to states that they should apply an arms embargo in Israel, including not providing any technologies or services or surveillance equipment that may be used for dual use, such as the case of AI capabilities and cloud computing services that I've mentioned. There's also now the ICJ advisory opinion on the illegality of the occupation and the obligation on states not to provide any aid assessment that maintains the illegal Israeli occupation, and the UNGA resolution. I think all of those documents provide very clear signals to the companies that there are a long list of potential or possible international crimes that they might find themselves complicit in. But unfortunately, I think given the atmosphere of full impunity in which the Israeli authorities continue to perpetrate these crimes until today, it gives these companies also the comfort that they should not be worried about any possible corporate criminal liability or any possible implications on their investments or in their businesses as a result of being linked to these crimes. And I think that calls for indeed immediate action to ensure that Israel is held accountable, as well as those companies that continue to provide these services in full secrecy and with complete disregard to the norms that we discussed. Thank you. I'll pass it back to you, Nada.
Thank you so much, Marwa, for this presentation and for all the information provided. Just to echo what you have said, special procedures did call on the international community, not only state, but also non-state actors such as businesses, to do everything they can to immediately end the risk of genocide against the Palestinian people and ultimately end Israeli apartheid and occupation. So with that, I wanted to open the floor for questions. We can take a couple of questions if there are. Go ahead, Pooja.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the side event. My name is Pooja. I'm with the Sexual Rights Initiative. And thank you very much for the perspectives and the information. I mean, the complicity and the impunity just keeps feeling like it's getting staggering as per every session. So thank you very much for the thing. I think one of the questions that I had was, because we have talked about the complicity of tech companies, what kind of consequences can we expect major tech companies to face as they continue to violate the international human rights law at this scale? And what can all the states and stakeholders here do to force these consequences, so to say? Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for this super important question, because I believe the issue of accountability should always be in discussion whenever we talk about those big tech companies. For example, unfortunately, there has been some precedent where big tech companies have been involved in exacerbating human rights violations at a large scale. For example, with the company Meta, there's been precedent in Myanmar, Rohingya refugees who have faced an increase in violence against their communities. Often the violence was emanating from incitement that's taking place on online platforms, on Facebook groups, Facebook pages, often paid, monetized groups. The connection between the ongoing violence against the Rohingya people at the time of genocidal nature, of course, was connected to what activity was taking place on Facebook as a platform. Similar is with the Ethiopian example. I think Tigrayan experience has also been involvement of a company like Facebook in disseminating harmful content that contributed to the violence on the ground. Both groups have taken the company to court in different jurisdictions, try to seek accountability, or try to basically hold the company accountable for disseminating harmful content that leads to violations on the ground. Us in Palestine, we are also considering, even us in Hamle, we're considering how we can utilize existing legal frameworks to hold companies accountable. Of course, we're talking about major big tech companies. However, for example, there's a legal framework called the Digital Services Act. It's an EU legislation, the DSA. The DSA itself defines those companies as very large online platforms. It includes Meta's platforms, YouTube, Amazon, etc. This act can be effective in helping us, raise concerns in a legal manner against those companies when they are violating people's digital rights in a systematic manner. Of course, if the ICJ does rule indeed that there is an ongoing genocide in Gaza, we're able to hold companies like Twitter X, for disseminating harmful content that contributes to the violence against Palestinians. We can hold the companies accountable with enough legal proceedings. We are also exploring what other legal frameworks exist. Unfortunately, some of the strongest legal frameworks that companies fear are only existent in the EU or in the US. Often they do, like we've seen how Elon Musk has treated the government of Brazil and the judiciary in Brazil with utter disregard. But we know that countries and states have power over companies, especially the states that host those companies. So we do explore different mechanisms to hold companies accountable, and we hopefully need to keep the issue of accountability in the picture, because that's the only way we can ensure that those violations do not occur again. If Marwa has any answer, feel free to contribute.
Yeah, thank you, Jalal. And thanks for the question. I think there are two main challenges we face. One is I think there's a governance and a legal gap when it comes to the legal path, as in corporate criminal liability and holding these companies accountable, and the extent to which where you can actually hold a company like Google or Meta responsible for being complicit in those crimes. There are, of course, possibilities, as Jalal noted, within national jurisdictions, but I am generally skeptic because when it comes to Israel or anything related to the Palestine, there often tends to be an exception. So the extent to which, for example, certain governments have the political appetite to pursue certain companies within jurisdiction under, for example, universal jurisdiction is maybe more difficult compared to other contexts. And the second challenge is these tech companies, the novelty of the tech companies and the difficulty also for civil society or maybe for lawyers if they want to pursue this legal action to make direct linkages, for example, between online content and violence that is perpetrated on the ground, where the threshold for evidence is much, much higher. Which leads me to the point that should not prevent us, of course, from continuing to document the human rights abuses and harms and violations that are associated or result from or stem from the company's policies and actions. And I think we do need more guidance and the development of more norms around the responsibilities of tech companies under international law. For instance, to date, there is not any clear guidance for how, for example, tech companies should conduct heightened human rights due diligence compared to other industries, such as extractives or mining industry. So I think there is a collective effort here, again, to develop more norms for companies, tech companies, and specific operating in situations of armed conflict. And secondly, to continue documenting and monitoring those abuses in hopes that, at least for now, civil society can use investor advocacy and other venues of accountability in the absence of clear legal mechanisms.
Jalal and Marwa, are there other questions in the room? If there are none, we only have 3 minutes to conclude. Just to say thank you very much for attending this event in person and online. And to reiterate, as Marwa said at the end, that while the UN guiding principles provide a framework to regulate the behavior of businesses, this is not binding. And the last decade has shown that companies will not abide by voluntary commitments. The Council needs to develop clear binding rules to hold businesses committing, complicit, directly, indirectly involved in human rights violations to account. One of those very important processes developed at the UN is the legally binding instrument on business and human rights, and it should be supported by states. In the meantime, states have an obligation to ensure an immediate physical and digital ceasefire in Gaza. And for Palestinians globally, states should ensure that tech companies adhere to business and human rights principles, as well as ensure that their platforms are not used to incite violence and promote genocidal content. A last point I wanted to make is regarding the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. It is a landmark document which for the first time 25 years ago recognized the right to defend rights. Civil society developed the declaration plus 25 years, and this document acknowledges that human rights defenders must be protected offline and online, while recognizing the expanding threats and the new and emerging technologies posed to human rights defenders, as well as the opportunities of human rights enjoyment and promotion available in the digital sphere. As such, we invite states to implement Article 9 of the Declaration, which provides important recommendations with relation to access to information and communication technologies, and protect against new and emerging forms of technology-facilitated rights violations. With this, we close our meeting, and we're happy to continue our discussion also outside. Thank you very much.